Hey guys, morning or afternoon, whenever you're watching this. We are diving back into the notes that we started in class yesterday. So if you haven't already, go ahead and pull up that note sheet that you got in class yesterday. I'm calling it the American Identity Notes, Student Notes, Part 1. You should be able to find that in Schoology or on that U.S. History calendar there. All right, so in class, here we go. In class yesterday, we just did some basics, kind of getting you to think about where you came from and then really the foundations of people in America. So, just a quick review here. We already went through a lot of this. And really, what we came down to is Americans have always kind of come for a lot of the same reasons. They've come to explore and for adventure, they've come for um, economic reasons, job opportunities, finding new ways to make money in a lot of different ways. They've come here to settle down and to raise a family. And they've come here also for the freedoms that we have. And we were able to see that through some of our just very early examples. Um, so, getting into this then, taking a look at the triangular trade, a lot of the reasons why, when we're talking about the colonies, why colonies are set up anywhere in the world at any time, the purpose of a colony is really to make money for the home country. And so when you're looking at the 13 colonies, the purpose of investing and having that land was to find a way to make money for Great Britain. And so that's where the triangular trade comes into play. The idea was that Great Britain was going to be able to get natural resources from American land, ship that back to Great Britain to make some finished goods. And so you can kind of see in this chart here some of the things that are going each way. Now, very, very early on in the settlement of North America in particular, but in South America as well, slave labor becomes part of that system. And so that's why we end up having a triangle. It's not just raw goods back and finished goods back and forth between North America and Europe, but because our economy relies on slave labor from the very beginning, we then push that down into Africa, where these slaves are being purchased or stolen, either way, from different parts of Western Africa there. So it's important to note that as we talk about the reasons why people came here originally, yes, it was for adventure and exploration. Yes, it was to make money. Yes, it was just for a new start to take advantage of some new freedoms. But there's a significant population of people here that didn't choose to come here for any of those things. They came here because someone forced them to, at gunpoint if necessary. And that has been part of our history from the very, very beginning. And so we're going to spend some time, just a little bit, taking a look at the slave trade here today because it is such a fundamental part of our economy early on. So in your notes, you should find the next reddish-pink section are a few questions to go along with this video in front of you.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy. The Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean, but the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants, with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease, and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before, and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare, but the Europeans who preached a universal religion, and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians, needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale, whose impact has continued long after its abolition.
All right, so as needed there, go ahead and pause this video to answer those questions. The reality is the African slave trade becomes the basis of our economic system, especially in the southern states. And it's going to be something that eventually we have to fight a war to end. And so we will continue to investigate the details of this itself, as well as the long-term ramifications of how slavery and in turn racist ideas affected our country. Right? All right. So just to get a quick image, we're just going to play part of this here, just to get an image of the numbers here when we're talking about the slave trade. Okay, we're looking at about 12.5 million Africans, and that's still 1866. That is when Brazil, I believe, finally outlawed the slave trade. And so what we're going to see here in this map is just looking at the numbers of slaves through this map coming over at certain times. Now this is for the Atlantic slave trade in general, not just to the United States, but also to the Caribbean as well. So the first recorded slave to be purchased in the United States was in 1619. However, slavery did exist in parts of the Caribbean and South America before then, as you can see in this map. By the year 1600, you have a pretty steady stream, primarily going into South America. And you can see it pick it up as we get further into the 1600s. By the mid-1600s, you start to see some of those dots making their way into different parts of the United States. A lot of the slaves that came into the United States oftentimes came up from the Caribbean and parts of South America, the first stop being in those regions before they were then shipped up north. However, the further we go on, we see more and more slave traders doing directly from Western Africa into the U.S. directly. Charleston, South Carolina is going to be the country that, the city that has the largest slave port. It brings in more slaves than any other city in the country. Remember, for each one of those dots, you're talking about hundreds of people that are brought to this country not because they choose to. They're being ripped from their families, taken from their homes, and forced to go to a different place that is unfamiliar with them to do work they're not being paid to do for the rest of their life. We'll continue to talk about the slave trade, and we'll actually look at it in our second try as well. But as talking about immigration, this is going to continue to be a group that we look at throughout. Post-revolution, then, we're going to start a time period where we have a new influx of Europeans choosing to come to America. We're calling this old immigration, and really it's that time period before the Civil War. So about 50 years or so before the Civil War. Actually, it runs it through Reconstruction time period. In this old immigration, you're going to have a lot of people coming from Western Europe, so Ireland, Great Britain, Germany, and so a lot of parts, this would be the time period where Wisconsin was founded as well, and we'll look at that in a second. So with each of these groups, Germans in particular are going to be settling inland. They're looking to basically recreate a similar lifestyle that they had in Germany, and the Midwest is going to give them that sort of environment. Also, you have the founding Germans are going to bring with them the idea of kindergarten as well. And we have the first kindergarten class recorded here in Wisconsin. Then for about 7 years or so, kind of in the middle of this, we have the Irish potato famine that's going to bring thousands and thousands of Irish immigrants into the United States. The Irish potato famine, I'm not going to take the time to watch that video if you want to learn more about it. It's a fascinating idea of how colonialism really destroyed part of the Irish population as well. A particular group of people raising potatoes. They were raising other crops, but they're being forced to sell all those other crops back to mainland Great Britain, and basically all they had left to eat for themselves were potatoes, and they ate a lot of potatoes, pounds and pounds of potatoes every single day. And that one strand of potato gets a disease, and suddenly people are dying. They're dying of starvation. That's what a famine is dying of starvation. And so they are either forced to stay and try to manage that situation or leave behind everything and try something else. And so with that, we have thousands and thousands of Irish immigrants showing up on the East Coast just looking for a fresh start to raise their families. So with this massive influx of immigrants coming in, keep in mind there really aren't any immigration laws at this point. If you can get here, you can probably stay here. And so they're already by 1840, there's already a significant pushback against people coming into America from other places. And this anti-immigration reaction, the vocab word here is nativist, and this is going to be a word we're going to use throughout the week here. So much so that it becomes a political item, a thing on a political agenda where people are voting based on a political party's immigration ideas. So there is a new political party that's going to pop up. They call themselves the American Party. And they run on a platform that is anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic agenda. And again, anti-Catholic kind of goes back to the Irish. A lot of them were Catholic. A lot of Americans that had been here were Protestant Christians. And they're going to call themselves the Know Nothing Party because they're going to claim they don't know anything about it. So you'll hear that every once in a while in U.S. history. They continue to have popularity for a good 15, 20 years, so much so that they run their own presidential candidate in the 1856 election. This is really close to the Civil War, and they won 22% of the popular vote. This is a situation where 1 in 5 people, voting Americans, pick the party that doesn't like immigrants and doesn't like Catholic folk coming to America. So that's a significant amount of the population, and it really kind of puts you in the frame of mind of how people are feeling about immigrants in this time period, specifically targeting the Irish here, but also a lot of discussion about Germans as well in America. So what are these nativists afraid of? Different cultures. People are coming in unapologetically. They're not looking to assimilate to America, whatever that means. They are looking to keep their culture, keep their language, keep who they are, just live here. So with that, we got different languages, different cultures, different religions. There was a lot of fear within the Catholics, and I chuckle because it seems crazy to me. There was a lot of fear that the Catholic agenda was going to try and get the Pope to run our government. And so they were afraid that there was going to be corrupt elections by getting religion involved within our election process, specifically the Catholic Pope. There was talk about fear of all these immigrants coming in and taking jobs. This is kind of the start of the Industrial Revolution here. Fear of them taking jobs, so there wouldn't be any jobs left for Americans. A lot of the same things that you hear today, for better or worse. So here's just one look, and I have this in your notes too, so go ahead and answer these questions here. But we have this anti-Catholic cartoon. This is a political cartoon. Right? And it says, the thing down below says the American River Gangs. So take a look at this. And if you look in detail here, you can kind of see who's on the beach and guess who maybe that is, given the title here. And take a close look at those alligators and try to figure out what really are those alligators if you look very closely there. You can also see what's happening in the background there. You got the White House with a cross on top and some other Catholic types of symbols around there as well. So I want you to take a look at the detail here, and there's tons of detail. Look up on the hill, you can see a hangman's noose in the background. You got people pulling each other up off of the beach. It's kind of an intense, very scary scene here. So what do you think this cartoon means? Just take a second and take a look at it and go ahead and answer that question before I move on. So it's in this time of old immigration that Wisconsin gets settled. And in our settlement, we have the French that came here first. We talked about that a little bit yesterday, and they're coming for economic reasons. They're looking to make some money here, and as they're coming in, they're finding that there are many Native American groups already living here. And in this chart, you can kind of see, and go ahead and answer the questions that are around here. Here you got tons of different tribes: Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sioux, Potawatomi, Ottawa, Ojibwa. Right? Lots and more than that. You can see it in the map there. So make sure you're getting those questions before we move on. So some of these tribes had been here for a very long time. Some of them actually had already been pushed. Some of them, in particular, gosh, which one was it? Ho Chunk? One of them, I don't remember which one. I guess I should know that. I'm so sorry. I will look that up. Had already been pushed from New York. They were from the New York region, but because of settlement in the state of New York, they'd already been forced off their land, and so they resettled in Wisconsin, which was already someone else's territory, right? So we got, tribes upon tribes here pushing each other, and now you got Europeans, Americans that are pushing into now this territory as well, and so it becomes very, very messy, very, very quickly, for sure. As far as exploration goes, when these Europeans show up, the French first, a guy by the name of Jean Nicolet is credited as the first European to explore our state. He goes into Green Bay, 1864. They set up that fort there, coming down through the Great Lakes, down from what is today Canada, and the UP there. And we know that he was there. Unfortunately, none of his original records have survived. So we don't have any of those primary source documents from him that have survived. So we don't know a lot of details about what he was doing or what he found. A very well-known group that came through his father, Jacques Marquette. If you know Marquette University, it's named after him. And Louis Joliet, both from France. They come together, and they come as missionaries, exploration as well, but as missionaries to spread Christianity throughout the tribes that they find in this area. So what they end up doing is they stop in Green Bay. That's like the place that you stop first, right? And some of the Native Americans in the area basically told Marquette about a big river. And so they actually take the Fox River down from Green Bay, and you can follow it on the map there, until they meet up with the Wisconsin River, and eventually they take that Wisconsin River down into the Mississippi River, and they're going to take that Mississippi River all the way down, right? And as they go, they're surveyors of sorts. They're going to chart the land that they see. And so by 1673, they are making their way to and down the Mississippi River, taking detailed notes about what they're seeing, what things look like, how this land can be used. And what this does is it's a roadmap, right, for people that come after them. They publish these findings, and then more people come in and they explore more, and they work with people in the area, and until you have a good idea of what is here. And once Europeans have a good idea of what's here, you start to advertise that, and then suddenly more people show up because they want to live here as well. So the earliest settlement within Wisconsin is actually going to take place in the southern region. And the United States, as a country now here, purchased land from native tribes. I put that in quotes because a lot of these were treaties and trades that were done and then kind of gone back on. But the idea was the United States purchased this territory from these native tribes, though technically they believe that they won this land in the Revolutionary War as well. So they're going to open this up area for European settlement. And with that, the first people that are going to come into Wisconsin are miners, because there was a ton of lead that was found in the southwest part of the state. So Platteville area, if you've ever been down there, tons and tons of lead that was found in this region. And so by 1815, we're not very far into our nation here, Europeans are going to start moving in, and they want to get the money quick, right? So mostly these are single guys, so they're coming in. They're not taking time to build homesteads, right? They just dig holes in the ground. As you can see, the one surviving one up there, they literally dig holes in the ground, and that's where they live, right? And then they work in the mines all day. They're mining lead, which is dangerous to mine. And then they go home and they live in the ground at night. And so they would get the nickname badgers, because that's what they looked like. It looked like their houses were badger dens, and they're always kind of dirty and that kind of stuff. Lead was very popular back then. They used lead for a lot of different things. It was a very soft metal that was easy to mold into many different things, from jewelry to shot for shotguns to water pipes, weights, paint, toys. So that's why if you live in an older home, you go to the doctor, they'll sometimes ask if you have lead in your house, because it was very, very popular back then. Now we know now that lead does not cooperate with our bodies, and so handling it or having your water run through lead pipes is not a good idea anymore. But at the time, it seemed easy and people didn't really understand the dangers of it. All right, we're going to pause right here and take a look at this video.
Soar across the land of Wisconsin, and it's possible to imagine that you've been transported to Europe, especially here in the picturesque village of New Glarus, which looks like a little slice of the Alps set down in the hills of southern Wisconsin. The town was founded in 1845 by immigrants from Glarus, Switzerland. Suffering from poverty at home, they came to America hoping to start new, more prosperous lives. Today, the town's residents are proud of their Swiss heritage and traditions. Nearby, at the New Glarus Brewery, members of a yodelers club come to bathe the valley with the sounds of traditional Swiss Alp horns. These long horns were once used in Switzerland by farmers to communicate with each other across remote valleys. Today, these Alp horns are blown just for fun and to embrace the history of one European community that settled this state almost 2 centuries ago. Another group of settlers was responsible for inspiring Wisconsin's nickname, the Badger State. In the early 1820s, lead was discovered in what's now the town of Mineral Point. When word got out, immigrants from Cornwall, England, flooded in, bringing with them expertise developed working deep shaft tin mines back home. Here on Merry Christmas Mine Hill, they dug more than 100 mines in their quest to reach the rich veins of lead below. Some miners, who didn't have any place to stay, ended up using sucker holes in the earth to use as shelters. Some can still be seen from the air. These primitive dwellings were called badger holes, for the way Cornish miners burrowed like badgers, and that's how Wisconsin got its nickname, the Badger State. But the Cornish were also skilled stonemasons. They quarried their own limestone blocks to build these small but sturdy cottages that still line the town streets. One street is named Shake Rag, after a local legend that the wives of miners here used to summon their husbands home for dinner by waving dishcloths from their doorways. By 1835, the flood of immigrants into places like Mineral Point and New Glarus had pushed Wisconsin's population over the 10,000 mark, making it eligible to be declared a U.S. territory by Congress. A sliver of land between Lakes Mendota and Monona was chosen as the site of the new territory's capital. It was named Madison, in honor of the recently deceased President James Madison. 10 years later, in 1848, Wisconsin became America's 30th state, and Madison its new state capital.
As much as possible, I always like to give us a little insight into our own history here and how Wisconsin plays into some of the other things that we're talking about. All right. So that, exactly like that video does, we are led to statehood here. Let me see if I can make this bigger again. Apologize for the weird clicking. All right, it's not working. Oh. All right. So it leads us, we're led back to we're led to statehood here, and so basically you have a massive amount of population growth, right? You're looking at about 11,000 people in 1836, and look at 1860 here. You're looking at 776 almost 1,000 people, and so there is a huge growth. A lot of that has to do with technology, things like the Erie Canal opening up more, and that wave of immigration from that what we call that old immigration time period of people coming from Germany in particular, but also we have some Irish here, right? You've got some Scandinavian cultures here in different pockets as well. And so with that population growth, we are able to make our way through the process to become a state. And In 1848, we pass our own state constitution, which is kind of the first one of the steps that we have to do. And then May 29th, 1848, President James K. Polk is going to admit us as the 30th state of the United States. One of the things that, hold on, sorry. All right, so why did that population grow so quickly? Many people did not settle until after, like I said before, that Erie Canal opened up. The canal is going to allow so many people to come in quickly. Before they were having to come overland. Now you could get a series of canals and make your way through the Great Lakes and settle in Wisconsin. A lot of them coming into Milwaukee, and then just literally like walking or traveling out from there. Tomorrow we're going to read a letter in class together about a family that came from Scandinavia, somewhere, Norway maybe, and they come into the United States and they basically walk to where they need to go. Later this week we'll talk about Joseph Goodrich, and he came into Milwaukee through a series of canals and basically walked until he found this region where we are now, and decided, hey, this looks pretty good, I'm going to stay here, for a number of reasons that we'll look at. So people are coming to Wisconsin for a lot of different reasons that we've talked about before, right? Miners, farmers, we got loggers up north, you got shopkeepers, you got runaway slaves coming here as well. And so by the late 1800s, towards the end of this old immigration time period, we have another boom in population due to industrial growth, especially along the Great Lakes. We have a boom in factories around there. And by the time 1918 rolls around, which is when the U.S. is going to enter World War I, 45%, almost half of the people in Wisconsin can say that they have some German ancestry. So that's why when we talk about who has German ancestry in class, a lot of people said yes, because it is definitely a part of who we are here in the United States. And as I go forward, we're going to take a look at this again when we go to a later immigration time period. We'll see, now that all these Germans are living here, how did that affect Wisconsin and our culture and who we are today? All right. Okay, the last thing that I'm going to have you do today before we move on is in your notes, there is a separate article that I want you to look at that looks at the meaning of the Wisconsin flag. We have a pretty detailed state flag. Obviously, you've got the year that we enter the Union and Wisconsin at top, but if you look at the detail within the picture in the middle, each one of those things offer a symbol to who we are and to our heritage as a state. And so that article in your notes will take you through this. I want you to pick two of those things and explain what the symbolism is there. And so the article will take you through that. There's several to choose from. I want you to pick two that seem interesting to you and write about it. All right, we will pick up with all of this tomorrow. Thank you so much. Make sure those red portions are filled out, and we'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day.